Thank you for joining us. We hope that you enjoyed today's service. God is using the ministry of Lakeside to make a difference in many people's lives, and we have heard numerous stories of life change. If God has used the ministry of Lakeside to make a difference in your life, we would love to hear your story. Please email us at amen@lakesidechurch.ca.
And we're doing this new series, a little 3-week series called Chasing After the Wind. Its roots are in the book of Ecclesiastes. It's Solomon, and he's on this journey to find soul satisfaction, and he journals the steps that he takes. And as I said last week, there are 6 basic things that every human heart hungers for. Here they are. Worth, we all want that. Acceptance, significance, security, purpose, and love. I want those. All of us in this room want those. None of us are immune from wanting those things. It's part of what it means to be human, to seek these things with all our heart. And yet I said last week that only a relationship with God will satisfy these desires. It's only when we look vertically at God for Him to be the satisfier of our worth and of our love and our significance and our acceptance and our purpose. It's when we turn to Him for that we truly, truly find it. And God created you and I with these 6 basic hungers. He wired them into us, but on top of that, He also knew He was the only one that could fully satisfy these desires of our heart. And the reason He did that is so that it would drive us to move towards Him, to find a relationship with Him, to find soul satisfaction from Him, because that's what God wants. He wants that kind of relationship with you and me. He loves us so much, He desires that we would seek Him above everything else we seek. And we looked at this verse last week. It says, take delight in the Lord. Find your happiness, find your joy, find the best of life. Where? In your relationship with the Lord. And when we do that, when we find it in Him, it says He will give us the desires of our heart. Those 6 desires will be ours if we take delight in the Lord. If we take delight in Him. And when those 6 basic desires get satisfied more and more, the other desires we have will either kind of fall in place or we'll come up with a whole new set of desires. Because if we desire God to satisfy these, God will redirect the rest of the desires that you and I have. But the natural gravitational pull of the human heart in a broken and fallen world is not to seek after God, not to seek vertically, but to seek horizontally from someone or something on this earth. And so often we turn to things like career or success or money or possessions, achievement, sex, power, relationships, the approval of others, all to what? Satisfy these desires. We look this way to find out how we can be satisfied when we should be looking vertically. And sometimes these things do satisfy for a short time, but they have a short shelf life. And eventually, they kind of wear off. And we don't want them, or we don't feel satisfied by them. And then we look for a whole new group of things, or we do those same searches only with greater intensity. And when we turn to something other than God to satisfy these basic desires of our heart, I said last week, that is what an idol is. And we become those who worship idols, those who seek after idols. Now, we don't think of ourselves as idol worshipers because we think of, sort of primitive pagans who are worshiping statues. We're not talking about physical idols. We're talking about the idols of our heart, the idols of our heart. And I defined an idol this way. An idol is anything we seek after more than God to give us what only God can give, the basic desires of our heart. And yet, we choose other things: money, achievement, approval, relationships, power, sex, religion. We can even make ourselves an idol. And we seek after and we worship these things, hoping they'll satisfy. But in the end, they don't. And we chase after one thing and it doesn't satisfy, and then we chase after another and another and another. And Solomon said, this is meaningless, this is empty, this is void. He said, this is the chasing after the wind, because you'll never quite take hold of what you're hungry for and what you're reaching for to satisfy your heart. And I said last week, the first thing we have to do is we need to identify the idol. And sometimes this can be a challenge. But I would encourage you to pray, God, help me to identify it. And then be honest and open, maybe talk to some other people and begin the process of knowing what is the idol. Now, that's kind of where we left off last week. I want to add a few more things to the end of that before we move into this week's thoughts. First thing I want to say is, add to the definition of idols, is idols are good things that we turn into ultimate things to satisfy our desire. Right? There's nothing wrong with embracing success or achieving well or having great relationships or having some power, sex, other things. There's nothing wrong with those. There's nothing wrong with them. They're good things. What happens, though, is we turn them into the ultimate thing to satisfy the desires of our heart. And that's where it gets us into trouble, because when we seek these things that are good things, but we seek them for the ultimate thing, it can leave us frustrated or angry or disappointed if someone stands in the way of us getting it. Or we can feel anxious or fearful if we think, I'm never going to be able to achieve or accomplish or get this. And at times, we can, feel overwhelmed in the pursuit because we're chasing after good things and we make them the ultimate things. And when it comes to what we worship, whether it be worshiping God or worshiping one of those idols, three things are true about our worship. Here they are. One, we will love the object of our worship, we will trust the object of our worship, and we will obey the object of our worship. So if it's God, we will do those things. But if it is something else that we're turning to give us the things that only God can give, we are going to fall in love with them. Our passions will be in their direction. We'll learn to trust them, and we'll obey them. You say, well, they don't ask for us to obey them. Yes, they do. Yes, they do. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention last week, and I just wanted to kind of bring into our focus this week, is there are two types of idols. The first type of idols are surface idols. Those are the easy ones to detect. If I show you what they are, here they are, you'll say, oh yeah, I can see that. Money and possessions become idols. Relationships and sexuality become idols. Achievement or success. Those ones are easy. They're superficial idols. But there are also deep idols, and this is what they are. Influence and power, approval and appreciation, emotional and physical comfort and control. And what happens is these are beneath the surface. These are harder to detect. These were not as easy to admit. And so these idols, these ones here, the superficial idols, we actually use them to satisfy, we use these idols to satisfy those idols. Because we can see these, but we can't see the other. And it's just what happens. The surface idols serve the deep idols. But then it plays out in different ways in different people. So for example, if I seek after money as my surface idol, I might use it because I like money for influence and power. Somebody else will come along and they'll say, money brings me approval and appreciation. Another might say, it's an emotional comfort. Another says, no, I use money for control. And so we have these superficial that actually play out in these deeper idols, and it brings a complexity to this. And so it's about identifying those idols, not at the surface. Those are easy. But it's identifying those ones that are below the surface. So today I want to start off by looking at why. What is the main reason, maybe the only reason, that you and I chase after superficial and deep idols instead of seeking after God? Why do we do this? And I think it boils down to one word: brokenness. I believe brokenness is behind all of our desires to worship these idols to bring us satisfaction. When I talk about brokenness, I'm talking about the wounds of the past, the voices of the past that still linger. I'm talking about childhood trauma that maybe some of us have experienced, or we grew up in an environment where love and achievement were tied together, or maybe significance was tied to success, or maybe there were very few genuine words or expressions of affection and love. Or maybe it's you felt unappreciated or undervalued because your parents were busy chasing their own idols. You see, when we're younger, we don't have the emotional, spiritual, mental maturity to say, oh, I must seek these things from God. And so we seek them from someone who is close to us, someone who we trust, someone who we believe has got our best interest at heart. So we seek them from parents and coaches and teachers, mentors, close relatives, someone we looked up to. We seek from them, and they don't come through. It might be something that they say over and over again. It might be something they model. We see it by example. Maybe it's something that they did when they responded to us or reacted to something we did. Whatever it is, that can skew our reason why. Instead of seeking after God, later on in life, we seek it from something else. For example, we all seek love. I think it's the primal desire of the heart is to be loved. But if there's sexual abuse or there's some kind of a trauma or a lack of attachment or the words aren't said very often or not at all and there are very few expressions, we can kind of get confused, and instead of seeking genuine love from God, we seek love through sex with somebody else to satisfy that desire. Worth is the same thing. If you've been verbally bullied or your parents constantly put you down or there was lots of yelling and screaming and you were made to feel worthless, you will seek worth through the approval of others because you still seek it. It could be significance, right? If appreciation and applause were something that were demonstrated in your home, if you were put on this performance treadmill, what happens is that we will seek after success and achievement to satisfy what? Significance, because we didn't find it. And you could take any one of these. I mean, look at love, right? Love can end up being lust and sexuality and power. Security can be money and things and relationships. Significance can be success, power, and achievement. Acceptance can be the approval of others. Worth can come up, we end up becoming so aware of our image, of our image management. How many 4.5s we get? For me, significance was directly related to success and achievement. It really was. Acceptance was all from the approval of others. And it was, I use this outward image to make other people think well of me. That was what went on. And that went on for years, and I can still struggle with that a little bit. But after 9 months of, pretty intensive self-discovery, I discovered there was childhood trauma behind some of this. And I came face to face with the lack of expressions and words of love in my family. And love was tied to performance, and it led to brokenness. And as a result, I became over-responsible, thinking I was responsible for everything. And I had to do everything, and I had to do it well, so people would appreciate me, so that they would approve of me, so I would be accepted. I became addicted to the approval of others. I was crushed by criticism and rejection. I was hungry for power, and anybody who disagreed, I could just power up. I turned into a workaholic and an adrenaline junkie. And it led to the deepest, darkest time of my life. And I sought those things to satisfy what only God could satisfy. This is my brokenness. And if it can happen to me, it can happen to any of us. I hear people time and time again say, I don't have any brokenness. I just want to laugh. Because we all do. We live in a broken, fallen world, and we interact and intersect with broken and fallen people, and we're bound to be broken. We're bound to be hurt. And so we need to understand this is often the root. And parents, I just want to say to you today, I encourage you to identify those idols. I encourage you to think about what you're doing. I encourage you to discern your brokenness and find out what you're seeking after, not just for your sake, although that's important, but for your kids as well. Because this cycle has been going on since the beginning of time, but in the last few decades, there seems to be this great intensity. And we have the opportunity, moms and dads here at Lakeside, we can break the cycle. We really can. It's helping our kids see these 6 things that they desire and helping them to find their way to God satisfying them. It's to pour into their lives. But the why is brokenness. Now, I want to look at how this affects us. So the how question. How does this impact us? How does this influence you and I? And Solomon, writing in Ecclesiastes, I mean, he just nets it right out. He says that, it's like what the word, chasing after the wind. You never get what you're going for. He says it's elusive. You'll never grab hold of it. He says he talks about academics and wisdom. He says the more you know, the more sorrow and grief you'll know, and the less likely you'll feel like relying on God. He says that this whole idea of achievement, like it's a bad deal. Sometimes, you'll achieve and achieve and achieve, and something will happen. Maybe it's a premature death or whatever, and you no longer get to enjoy what you've achieved, and someone else will get to enjoy it, and who knows what they'll do with it? Who knows? And he says that he sees this man all alone because sometimes it can be a lonely journey when achievement is what you're after, and you can isolate yourself from the people you love the most. On top of that, he says, when you're gone, you won't be remembered. They'll forget you. You achieve all these things, but they'll forget you. I remember like 18 years ago, I had left the church that I was pastoring in St. Catharines, and I came here. And I was here about 6 months, and I called back, and the woman who answered the phone, I knew her well. She worked there when I worked there. And I said, hey, good morning. It's Dave. Can I speak to John? You know what she said? Dave who? I said, I've been there for 5 years. Look at all I achieved. She said, Dave who? It won't even take 6 months till you're saying Dave who after June. It won't take long because we're not remembered. And he says that's a downside. He says money, you never have enough. It never satisfies. You'll always want more. It permits no sleep. It's hoarded to your harm, and it can be lost to misfortune. And he says you can have it all and not enjoy any of it because pleasure is empty and it's meaningless. And he says we all face the same common destiny. You know what that is? Death. We all die. Very positive book. Solomon says, you know what? You got to be careful, folks, on this journey to find soul satisfaction because it can have an influence and an impact, and it's not a good one. But if there's one section of the Bible that I believe nets out the most negative impact and influences and consequences of chasing after idols, is Romans chapter 1. 21 to 32. And Paul is writing to the Romans, and there's lots, Caesar has made himself to be God. He wants to be venerated. He's deified himself. And that's why the Roman world had a problem with the followers of Jesus, because Jesus was to be the king. Jesus was to be the Lord. And the Romans said, no, that's Caesar. And so there's this idea of idol worship. There's a pantheon of Roman gods. And Paul is writing, and he's writing to these followers in Rome. And they're not worshiping those gods, but they're worshiping the idols of the heart. And he uses this as kind of a metaphor to speak to them. And so this is what he starts off by saying. For although they knew God, this word knew is they've observed, it's visible, there's been understanding, there's evidence. That's what he's saying. And he's just said, because of creation, God's power, God's nature, and God's character have been easily and fully demonstrated. So he says they know God because they can tell there is a God, but they neither glorified him. The word glorify means to venerate, it means to worship, it means to celebrate, it means to give honor, esteem. It's a worship word. They neither worshiped him as God. So they although they knew God, they didn't worship God, nor gave thanks. The word thanks here is an interesting little Greek word. It's Eucharisto, where we get the word Eucharist from, which is a Thanksgiving celebration. That's what it's about, the Eucharist, Thanksgiving celebration. And he says they're not celebrating, they're not thankful for all God has done. And then he gives us the first thing that affects us when we chase after these idols. It's right here. Their thinking became futile. Because here's what happens. It affects the way we think. It does. The word futile means worthless, destitute, without meaning, empty, foolish. And it's not just about what you put in your mind, but it's about what directs you. It's your intentions. It's your purpose. Later on, he's going to say, God gave them over to a depraved mind. It affects your thinking. Your mind can become depraved, which really means unworthy, unacceptable, worthless. He says it affects your thinking. It gets into your head. It starts there. It's empty. It's void. It's worthless. You think differently about things. And when your mind begins to change, your attitude begins to change. And when your attitude changes, it bleeds out into your action. That's why Paul always, when he writes, starts with the mind. He says that, that we need, it's a worship passage, Romans 12, 1 and 2. He says that we need to be transformed, by the renewing of our mind. He always starts there with our thinking because he knows our thinking is so easily affected. And then Paul writes on, he goes on, kind of builds on this. He says this, and although they claimed to be wise, they became fools. And they stopped worshiping God and they worshiped images. He said, the second thing that he says to them is this, they abandoned wisdom for foolishness. And the word foolishness in the Bible often describes abandoning God. The fool said in their heart there is no God. That's what foolishness is about. So this is about abandoning godly wisdom. Oh, they thought they were wise, but it was foolish. And when they came to those major events and decisions and choices, they stopped asking the question, what is the wisest thing to do? They stopped asking that. They stopped looking to God for wisdom. They stopped looking for wise counsel. And they make decisions and choices that are foolish, are impulsive, with little thought of how it'll play out. What are the consequences? They don't think about that. When we abandon wisdom and our thinking gets skewed, we chase after these things to satisfy our heart. And as we chase after them, our perspective and our insights and our impulses and our intuition, they get a little fuzzy and out of focus. And we seek these other things and we stop thinking about consequences and we stop thinking about how it might hurt others and we stop making wise choices. And the more we do this, the more pervasive it gets. And I hear this so often when people have made these unwise choices, seeking the desires of their heart. Apart from God, they'll say these words when the bottom drops out and the consequences are critical. They'll say, what was I thinking? Right? What was I thinking? Why did I make such a foolish and stupid choice? It's because these desires affect our wisdom. They affect our mind if we seek after them from something horizontally. He goes on. Actually, it's the second part of verse 21. He says, they didn't give thanks, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. So not only does it affect your mind, not only does it affect your wisdom, but it affects your heart. It affects your heart. It does. It affects your heart, the affections of your heart. The heart in this writing is about the emotional side of us, the center of us, desires, affections, passions, and impulses. You see, what happens is we get kind of out of focus for the things we should be passionate about. God, family, those kind of things. And we get our passions and our focus and our love for something other than them that we think will satisfy. And what happens is when you give all of your passion to this, it's like a well. You drain all the water out of the well when you have to give it to those people who deserve your love, deserve your passion, deserve your focus. You don't have anything left to give. It's why men and women were willing to sacrifice their kids to satisfy the idols of their heart. This is why affairs happen. This is why parents, and what they do to their kids and what kids do to their parents and how families get wrecked. And, because power can wreck. All these things can wreck us because they get into our heart. And he says the heart is darkened. And I searched through the pages of the Bible wondering, what does it mean to be dark? And these are some of the words that I came up with. Emptiness, garbage dump. It's bad, destruction, barrier between us and God, gloom, sadness, uncertainty, fear, evil, lack of wisdom, rebellious nature, not able to find our way. There's very few things that are positive about darkness in the Bible. And our hearts can be darkened, and so do our passions and our loves and our affections. They go in a dark direction. And yet this is so hard to see because what does darkness do? Darkness blinds us, and we don't see it. And we have the capacity, because of our affections and because of our loves, that when our heart gets dark, we don't see what's going on. We don't. We're blind to it. And that's why sometimes it's hard to detect or hard to admit. In this little one-chapter book in the Old Testament, this prophet Obadiah says this: the pride of your heart, in other words, you know what, I'm good, I'm proud, You who live in the clefts of the rocks. He's talking about fortress-like. Nothing can hurt you. And make your home on the heights. You are, nothing can get to you. Nothing can hurt you. Nothing can get to you. And you say to yourself, who can bring me down to the ground? You know what that phrase is in our modern vocabulary or verbiage? It's this. It won't hurt me. I can handle it. I'm fine. Because we don't see the deceit in our heart and where our heart is passionately going in the wrong direction. And I've watched people whose hearts get so dark because they are gripped by an idol. They don't see it, and their love gets skewed, and they pursue the wrong things, and they hurt the right people, or they hurt the wrong people, and things are good. And others look on and go, look how they're wrecking their lives, and they're going, not me, I can handle it, I'm fine. Why does that happen? It's because our hearts get deceived. And then he goes on. And they exchanged the glory of the immortal God. So they stopped worshiping God, and they started worshiping things that look like mortal human beings. And some believe the grammar is they started worshiping mortal human beings. They started worshiping themselves. They started worshiping themselves. And this is so important. We become what we worship. We become more and more like what we worship. What we become is a result of what we worship. If you worship money, you can become greedy. If you worship sex, you can become lust-filled. If you worship power, you can use it inappropriately and corruptly. If you worship achievement, you can get overwhelmed and sort of overachieve and overworked. If we worship the approval of others, we can become the slaves to others. If we worship beauty and self-image, we can become vain and ego-driven and shallow. Often what we pursue kind of comes back on us. It says this in Psalm 115, verses 4-8. But their idols are silver and gold made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, noses but cannot smell. They have hands but cannot feel, feet but cannot walk, nor can they utter sound with their throats. But here's the key, he says, those who make them will be like them, and those who will trust in them. That's a worship word. In them, right? He says, we become like those things we chase after. We do. We do. You see, God created us in his image. We are image bearers of God. That's what Genesis 1 is all about. We're image bearers of God. And what it means to be an image bearer, it means to be a reflector. And imagine you have a mirror. Your life is a mirror. And when you point it to God, you begin to reflect God to others in your world. That's why Jesus said, let your light shine. Let your light be reflected so that people, when they see your good deeds, they will what? Glorify God. They'll worship God because they see God in you. But sometimes the mirror doesn't point towards God, it towards things and people. And whatever that we pursue after to satisfy our heart, we become the reflection of that. The idols we choose are what we become. We can become greedy and control freaks and power hungry and promiscuous and live for pleasure because we're reflecting what we worship. He goes on. Therefore, God gave them over in the sinful desires of their heart to sexual impurity for the degrading of their bodies with one another. What he's basically saying is God takes his hands off. It's this little phrase, God gave them over. It's not something that God did, it's something that God allowed. God allows them to do this. Basically, God is saying this to them. You can freely choose, but you're going to experience the complete consequences. You will. You have all the freedom. God says, I'm taking my hands off. I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to put obstacles in your way. I'm not going to discipline you. Just go for it. Go for it. Go crazy. Go wild. Do whatever. Pursue them with as much passion as you can. But you need to understand that you will face the full onslaught of your circumstances. In verse 27, he says that they will receive in themselves the due penalty for their errors. That we'll get this penalty, but it's not because God's inflicted. It's simply because we've gone on these unrestrained searches. You know, I find it very interesting when people pursue idols, and then the bottom drops out. And they often look heavenward and say, God, why did you allow this? God, why are you doing this? God's going, I didn't. These are the human consequences of which that you paid because you made choices to pursue something other than me to satisfy your heart. I mean, there's this basic Bible principle, right? Whatever we sow, we reap. That's what this is all about. Well, he goes on. He says they exchanged the truth about God for a lie. So they had these misconceptions of God. They didn't have a true picture of God. They had this lie. He was a cosmic cop, or he's there for my comfort, or there for my success, or there for my achievement, or there for my cause. They just had this wrong picture of God. And because they had this inaccurate picture of God, they worshiped and served created things rather than the Creator. So it says they worshiped, we already talked about that, but they also served them. They serve them. You see, we become servants to the idols we worship. We do. We do. The idol we worship becomes the master, and we become the servant. And when the master makes a demands, sometimes we're willing to cross our values and belief lines. We're willing to cross certain boundaries. They can cause us to think thoughts we'd never thought we'd ever think, and they can demand desires and affections of our heart to go in another direction, and we stop thinking, and our hearts go the wrong way, and it all falls apart. But sometimes the demands are greater than just making us servants. Sometimes these idols demand so much that we become slaves, because the pursuit of money can become an idol, but it also can become addictive. So can the approval of others, so can sex, so can relationships, so can pleasure, power, control. We can all get addicted to any one of those, and then we become the slaves of them. I have watched people get in such a hold of one of these pursuits that grabs them, and they wonder, I can't break free, because they become a slave. They become a slave. When these dark demands become our taskmaster, when these idols become our masters, we can end up in slavery. That's why Paul said to the Romans later on, don't let anything master you. Don't let it be in master over you. You don't want to be a slave or a servant to anything except for me. Paul says later on in another letter he writes, he says, it is for freedom that Christ has set you free. Don't find yourself enslaved all over again. And yet sometimes we do, because we end up being the servants to the idols. And then he goes on and he finishes this section. He says, furthermore, just as they did not think it worthwhile to retain the knowledge of God, so they kind of forgot who God was, or they just said, no, we're not going to even think about God. He says, God gave them over, right, understand, to a depraved mind. Again, a depraved mind is sort of worthless. It's negative. It's away from God, so that they do what ought not to be done. In other words, when the mind and the heart get changed, we start doing things we don't want to do and we know we shouldn't do. And it says, and then look what happens. It says they become filled with what? Every kind of wickedness, all kinds of wickedness, evil, greed, and depravity. This is, really sort of dark things that you choose. They're full of envy and murder and strife, deceit and malice. They're gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, arrogant, and boastful. They invent ways of doing evil. I mean, they come up with some real creative ideas. They disobey their parents, which is about relationships. They have no understanding. They don't, they just don't think. They have no fidelity. They're not faithful. They don't love well. They have no mercy. They're not compassionate. Now, I don't know about you, but when I look at that list, I don't want that said about me. And yet he says this is what can happen, because what he's saying here is that it can lead us to greater destructive consequences than any of us ever imagined. You look at those 21 vices I read, none of us want them on our resume, and yet left unchecked, this is what will happen. We will go more and more destructive, and sometimes we won't know it because we're deceived. Because we're deceived. None of us want these words attached to us, do we? You want any of those 21 attached to you? I don't. And yet, left unchecked, some of them it could be said about us. If you think of God as in the center of a circle, these 6 things point towards God to be fully satisfied. But when we stop taking one of these or all of these and pointing them to God, and we point them outward to other things, eventually we go further and further away from God. And when you go further and further away from God and you don't retain the knowledge of God, he says the consequences can be greater than any of us ever imagined. And it's hard in our culture because we have a culture that is just bent on sort of individualism. And idolatry in our culture has become a norm. We don't even recognize it often. And we think it's just what everybody's doing. It's just part of living in the 21st century. And it can distort our thinking, and it can deceive our heart, and we can end up paying the price. Because when these idols grip your heart and mine, we get these false definitions of what it means to be satisfied, and we get these false directions to satisfy them. And we seek the wrong places to find our worth and our acceptance, our purpose, love, significance, and security. And it can happen so easily, and we can get so deceived. You know, I think of people who are single who say, oh, if I ever get married, I'll be fully satisfied. If you're sitting next to a married person, see how that works. It doesn't satisfy. Oh, it helps. It's important. They're good things to have. But if it becomes the ultimate, it won't satisfy. And I think that's what happens to some people is they're in a relationship and it doesn't satisfy, and so they say, I'm going to go find another one, and I'm going to find another one because I need to be satisfied because I think relationships will do it. I think of people who have kids, and they think kids are going to satisfy their desires. Not when they're teenagers. And when they don't satisfy, you know what mom and dad do? Well, they didn't satisfy, so let's go and find something else that does. And we go on this all-out pursuit for something else, and our kids get left in the dust. I think people who think their career or their job, what they do, will satisfy. It just doesn't. It never will. If we pursue that for soul satisfaction, you know, I've watched people who quit great jobs because of this. I've watched people get fired from jobs because of their attitude. I've watched people who have been awful bosses because they're looking for these things to give them soul satisfaction. It doesn't cut it. It just doesn't. I think of the money that gets spent and money that gets wasted on buying things and whatever. And then we get drowning in debt, and we got to overwork, and we got to be overwhelmed, and we got to stay in this job, and we really don't like it, and the only reason is we're trying to service some debt because we thought getting what we want would bring us satisfaction in our heart. I think about the physical, mental, emotional, and relational hurts. I think about the wounds inflicted and the people who are broken because someone they loved chased after one of these idols, and it affected their mind and their heart and their perspective and their wisdom, and everybody's paying a price. But I want you to imagine this morning how different it really could be, how different it could be in your life and mine if we would just take time to say, I need to look at these things. Do I have these idols? And imagine if we removed them from their place. And imagine if we replaced them with someone else. Imagine something else. Imagine if we discovered the brokenness and say, that's the why. Or we discern the consequences. Or we had the courage to make countercultural choices away from the idols. Imagine how your life could be different. Imagine how mine could be. Imagine how you would be as a parent and as a spouse and as a friend and as a worker. If you stop seeking after all of these wrong things and put your focus vertically. Because it's where we turn our focus that makes all of the difference. It's where we turn. It's where we look to satisfy our hearts. And next week, I'm going to talk about how we satisfy our hearts. So you got to be here to get the answer. Let's pray. Father God, I just thank you. Your word is practical. It's real. It's life impacting. It speaks, although it was written thousands of years ago, it speaks into us today. It speaks into us today. May we have the courage to examine our hearts. May we look and see, are there any idols? May we see the consequences. May we not be blind to what's happening in our hearts. Give us the courage to look. Give us the courage to live and to seek after you. May you be the delight of our lives so that you will satisfy the desires of our heart. Jesus, may we keep our eyes on you, focused on you, because that's the place we need to start if we're going to find freedom from pursuing these idols. We pray these things in your name. Amen.
Thanks so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed this message. To hear it again or other messages, please visit us at lakesidechurch.ca.